Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending upon where you are in the world, and welcome to today's DevOps.com webinar. I'm Charlene O'Hanlon, moderator for today's event, and I welcome you. As always, we have a great event on tap, but before we get started, I do have a few housekeeping items I need to go over. First of all, today's event is being recorded, so if you miss any or all of the event, you will have the opportunity to access it later on. Following today's webinar, we will be sending out an email that contains a link to access the webinar on demand. And we are taking questions from the audience. So if at any time during today's presentation you have a question for either of any of our speakers, please don't wait, don't hesitate. Just use your GoToWebinar control panel and submit your question, and we will try to get to as many questions as we can near the end of today's webinar. We also have 3 polling questions during today's webinar, so please do your best to participate. And at the end of today's webinar, we are doing a drawing for 4 $25 Amazon gift cards. So please stick around. Hopefully you'll be one of our 4 lucky winners. All right, let's get on with today's webinar, which is the journey from Heroku to Kubernetes in 5 steps. Our speakers today are Kendall Miller, who is the president of Fairwinds. He's being joined by Nate Baker, who is in SREs, Site Reliability Engineer at Fairwinds, and Ivan Fetch, who is also a Site Reliability Engineer at Fairwinds. Gentlemen, thank you all so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
All right, great. Well, let's see, Kendall, I know you are going to be leading off the conversation with lots to say, so I'm going to take myself off camera, put myself on mute, let you get right to it.
All right, thanks. So let's dive in, folks. Welcome to the journey from Heroku to Kubernetes in 5 steps. We'll introduce ourselves a little bit further here. As mentioned, I'm Kendall Miller, president at Fairwinds. I've been working in the Kubernetes space for the company's been in business about 5 years, and we've been Kubernetes focused exclusively for more than 4 of those. Nate, Ivan, you want to introduce yourselves? I'll start with Nate. Tell us how long you've been in SRE. What a little bit about your background. You don't have to go deep into the weeds, but you're muted, Nate. No, and I can't hear you. Ivan, do you want to go first while we sort out
Sure.
Nate's audio?
No problem. So my name is Ivan Fetch, and I've been doing Kubernetes for about a couple years and working in general operations, turned DevOps type things for somewhere around 20.
Okay, Nate? No, still nothing. You did totally fine in the warm-up, and then we get started, and it looks like you're not on mute according to the system, but maybe your audio died. If you want to pop out and rejoin back in or something. Nate has been at Fairwinds for over a year, working with Kubernetes exclusively here, and has a long background in ops. And we'll get to him if his audio. It looks like it came back on. Nate, anything to add to that? We can hear you now. Can you hear us?
We can hear you clicking.
Cool.
Yep,
well,
we got
your earbud though, because I don't think they're working anymore.
Okay.
Yeah, so I've been at Fairwinds for a little while now. I've been always working in the operations space, for the past 8-9 years or so. I've been working with Kubernetes since about 2016, somewhere in there. Done a bunch of migrations of various web apps and just all kinds of apps into Kubernetes. It's a blast. So excited to talk about going from Heroku to Kubernetes.
Good. Thanks, Nate. So a little bit about Fairwinds. We are the Kubernetes enablement company. We have been, as I mentioned, focused on Kubernetes for over 4 years. We have a combination of software and services for helping people get up and running successfully on Kubernetes. So it's my firm belief that everyone would be using Kubernetes if they believe they could do it at scale, securely, reliably, and efficiently, and that's what we focus on. So we have a SaaS platform for companies to expose things in the security, reliability, and efficiency space. That's Fairwinds Insights. We have a managed service called ClusterOps, where we build and maintain Kubernetes for customers, often migrating to ClusterOps from a place like Heroku. That's why we're giving this talk today, is we've migrated a lot of people from a PaaS, often specifically Heroku, to a managed service on top of Kubernetes because people want that similar kind of experience as Heroku. We also offer expertise and support in an advisory capacity, and we have an opportunity for just getting up and going on Kubernetes that we call Quick Start. So services, software, we have a whole bunch of open source. Whether you ever engage with us in the future or not, there's lots on Fairwinds that we can get into more in a little bit, but this is a thing that we've done a lot, this specific journey from Heroku to Kubernetes, and that's why we're here today. So please do ask questions as we go along. There is a question box on the sidebar, as mentioned, in GoToWebinar, where you can pop questions in. I'll try to keep an eye on those, and if they're relevant as we go, we'll address them. We also have some time marked off at the end to get to questions, so we can dig into more there if you have specifics. Today, the agenda looks like this. We're going to start with step 1, understanding, knowing why you're moving to Kubernetes. Step 2, put a plan in place. We'll get into some of the specifics of how you need to plan around it. Step 3, dive into the process. What do the actual pieces look like? Step 4, optimize for security, reliability, and efficiency. And step 5, revisit and reevaluate your goals. And then we'll have some time for Q&A at the end. So know why you are moving to Kubernetes, and we're going to pause here and throw up a poll, and so you can talk to us about why you're considering this kind of thing. And Charlene, there we are.
Poll question should be on your screen now. The question is, what are the reasons you are looking to migrate off of Heroku for another PaaS? Go ahead and select all that apply. Security and compliance challenges, the need for more flexibility or granular control, want to leverage infrastructure as code, or cost. Go ahead and make your selections. And while we're doing that, just want to remind the audience that at any time during today's presentation, if you have a question, please go ahead and use your GoToWebinar control panel. You don't have to wait until we get to the question and answer period to submit your questions. Okay, we'll give you guys about 10 or 15 seconds longer to make your selections, and then we'll close it out. We'll take a look at the results.
Great.
Okay, looking like, okay, we're gonna go ahead and close it out now. And here are the results here.
Wow.
So yeah, I mean, just to address a little bit of this, security and compliance challenges, I do know, like, actually security and compliance and that second option there, need for more flexibility or granular control, are maybe hand in hand in a lot of ways. The two main reasons we see companies move off of a PaaS, or specifically Heroku, is this, that at some point, almost every company outgrows Heroku in terms of they need more flexibility, and that can be for security or compliance. That can be just they want to have some kind of granular control because their application needs it, or there's all kinds of reasons for that. And the second main reason we see is at some point cost becomes prohibitive. There's a lot of nice things about a PaaS, but cost can overwhelm things. So thanks for answering the poll. We've got a few more as we go. We'll turn back over and keep going. So know why you're moving to Kubernetes. Let's talk a little bit about this. Why do companies choose Kubernetes? Nate, you want to start?
Yeah, I think Kubernetes is great because it gives you a framework to start building on. It's really flexible. It can take many different shapes and forms. Heroku, you kind of have to build inside of a box, but with Kubernetes, you can kind of, it's really modular. You can expand it in different ways. So I think the flexibility is one of the big things.
Yeah, well, and even back up, I meant to ask, why do companies choose Heroku? Sorry. What are the reasons that a company would choose a PaaS in the first place?
That's super quick to get started. You don't have to know much of the infrastructure behind the scenes. You can kind of just have your app and deploy it, and then off you go. It makes that extremely nice, getting from nothing to something in a really quick rate.
Yeah, I would add, I think, particularly when you're a small company, choosing for basically a no ops opportunity, getting tools that make it so that your operational overhead is basically zero, is a big reason why companies choose a PaaS. Early on in your journey as a company, you can be very specific about being flexible with your applications so that the infrastructure just works. And it tends to be as companies get larger and need to be able to change some of those things. So I think, like Nate said, for ease and for speed, I often tell companies that are new, just getting started, go with a PaaS, choose Heroku, throw your application on there. Heroku is an amazing platform that is all encompassing, has all of the pieces. And this is not a webinar about bashing Heroku. We're going to be getting specific into the places where people outgrow it. But there's this quote from Kelsey Hightower: "I'm convinced the majority of people managing infrastructure just want a platform as a service, a PaaS. The only requirement is that it has to be built by them." And Ivan, can you maybe talk a little bit about how Kubernetes enables you to build your own PaaS?
Sure, there's a lot of flexibility, as Nate mentioned a bit ago, in Kubernetes. And so you can tune how you want your deployment and development workflow to look a little bit more than you could otherwise do with Heroku. You've got a lot of flexibility on how you ingress traffic into your cluster, how you scale up and down your application and your cluster size. There's just tons of benefits, but those are some of the highlights, and they tie into that flexibility piece.
And to go back a little bit, even in our company history, when we began 5 years ago, we wanted to build a framework for building infrastructure as code, because starting as just straight consultants, we realized everybody in the DevOps space has the same needs. They all want to auto scale. They all want to deploy in flexible ways. Everyone needs centralized logging, monitoring, alerting, et cetera. There's a lot of those pieces that we went out and built a very impressive framework 5 years ago for doing all of this. Kubernetes began to gain popularity, and we took a look at it and said, oh my goodness, this is that framework that we wanted for building infrastructure as code. In the same way that if you're familiar with Ruby on Rails, Rails is a framework for building Ruby applications very, very quickly. It's a very similar concept to Kubernetes is a framework for building a platform as a service very, very quickly and with infrastructure as code. So as we mentioned, and looking at that poll, when you reach a certain point where you need that control and customization and or cost savings, that tends to be when we see people really consider this. So let's dive into, we've got another poll right here, put a plan in place. Let's talk about, where are you in your journey to Kubernetes?
Yeah, so the polling question should be up on your screen now. Where are you on your journey to Kubernetes? You can select from one of the following: just starting to think about it, testing some things out with non-production, running some workloads in production, or completely set up in production. So go ahead and make your choice, and we'll give you guys about 30 seconds or so to make your selection. And again, want to remind you, if you got a question, please don't hesitate. Just use your GoToWebinar control panel and submit your questions. And hopefully we'll have about 10 minutes or so near the end of the webinar to go through audience questions. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close out the poll now and take a look at the results. Here we go.
All right, yeah, just starting to think about it with 28%, testing some things out with non-production, 48%, running some workloads in production at 21%, and completely set up in production at 3%. So this actually reflects a lot of, there'll be polls every year on the state of DevOps, the state of Kubernetes. I almost said Devernetes, which is a word that I now need to coin somehow. There is a lot of companies out there. I think it's something like 70% have something running in Kubernetes, either in non-production or in production, but there's still very few companies that are completely set up and running completely in production on Kubernetes. And a big part of the reason for that is Kubernetes is a fundamental paradigm shift from the way that operations used to be done. And in the history of the cloud, it used to be that you could migrate everything from your data center into the cloud and just keep operating the cloud as though it's your data center. And Kubernetes really pushes people to adopt the fundamental things that are advantageous about the cloud. And as a result, it's a really big paradigm shift. But we can wrap up that poll and get going. So put a plan in place. Let's get into some of these specifics. How do we get the entire company on board with the goal of moving to Kubernetes? Often this is a question. You know, if I'm a CTO at a big company, why am I going to re-platform? Why am I even going to consider a re-platform? Ivan or Nate, you want to talk about some of the business reasons to pitch internally?
I think snacks and pool tables, isn't that what supposedly drives everything? No, to be more serious though, there's a few elements here that we see be common drivers. Savings is one big one that likely enough tiers of a company or a business are gonna be concerned about. Using infrastructure as code as a benefit, which is certainly a big piece of this journey, as you just mentioned, Kendall. Pushing the cloud native landscape of things was pushed with cloud, and particularly is pushed moving into Kubernetes. So infrastructure as code is going to bring some transparency, easing onboarding new hires, new applications, etc. We'll talk a little more about that, as well as producible and reproducible environments, and getting the opportunity to learn new technology along the way. While it's probably shouldn't be a primary driver to follow the quote unquote new hotness, there are reasons why Kubernetes is the thing in terms of the orchestration that has pulled ahead in the race. How about you, Nate? Other things to add to that list as well?
Yeah, I think you covered the big ones for me. I think one of the cool things about Kubernetes is really its self-healing nature and the automated deployments that you can get out of it. You can, if you build your servers properly, it can withstand outages in a really nice way. Before Kubernetes, it was like everybody was trying to build something that did something Kubernetes-esque. They were trying to achieve the rolling deployments. They were trying to achieve the this securing all your ingresses and having that nice monitoring and centralized logging. So I think that's one of the big things for me, is just it makes your company feel so much smoother, because if you get your developers and your operators on board, just getting your code out the door, you have shared responsibilities with Kubernetes. It's a really nice win for your whole engineering team, and then your business will benefit.
Yeah, I think you touched on something there, Nate, that's interesting, that when you're using a platform as a service, you're really at the mercy of where that platform as a service is running, how it's built underneath. And if Heroku goes down and you're on Heroku, your application goes down. Now, that's the same as, if you're on AWS and AWS goes down, but it's actually really rare that AWS goes down. Sometimes a region will go down or an availability zone. And if you have control over the fine-grained aspects of your infrastructure, you can have built in those fail-safes specifically based on where your users are, based on what you know to be single points of failure. You just have a lot more control over that, and that has significant business value for a lot of companies. 5 minutes of downtime is hundreds of thousands of dollars lost. I mean, it depends on who you are and what you're doing, but that's a big piece of it, is you have some control over that. I also think, to touch a little bit on what Ivan said, developers do like to work with the newer, better technology, and this Kubernetes is the direction that everything is going. In a few years, whether it's underlied by Kubernetes or not, almost everything is going to have Kubernetes as the base. And engineers who understand it and learn to develop in that paradigm, learn to write code and ship it in a container, are going to be more out on the edge, and engineers know that, and they want to work at companies that are going to help enable them to sustain that for their career. It also, using Kubernetes, writing code and shipping it in a container removes some of the "it works on my computer" issues that we see, because instead of running code on your physical computer and then trying to get all the settings in your cloud to look the same as your physical computer, you package it up, you put it in a virtual machine of the, I guess a container is a sort of virtual machine on steroids, but you put it in this virtual machine and ship that to the cloud, and it's literally, it's virtually the same machine as what you were running on your own computer. So
yeah, definitely the image becoming the artifact is a somewhat heavy feeling paradigm shift at times, depending on a lot of the details of your organization and the perspective of engineers. But that's a pretty powerful shift. Having that image get promoted through the dev, QA, staging, and production lifecycle is a really, really powerful thing, and it requires some shifting, and that's something we can help with.
Yeah. So if you're using Heroku, you're already running on top of, it's a Salesforce product, but it runs on top of AWS today. A lot of times a company who's migrating off of something like that asks us, which cloud should I use? And Nate, what are the kinds of things that we consider when we're giving advice about that?
Typically, Kubernetes is going to look the same on any of the cloud providers that you run on. You're going to interact with the clusters, like a cluster on Google and a cluster on Amazon. You're going to interact with them almost the exact same way. I think the biggest thing to consider is the other services that you're using inside of a cloud provider. Most cases, if you're on Heroku, your data is most likely in AWS. You're probably using an RDS service or some kind of service in Amazon already. So making that transition into Amazon is not that big of a jump. If you wanted to switch from something from Heroku to GKE or Google, you have to consider where your data lives and how you're going to migrate your services. So I think the biggest question is not where is Kubernetes going to run the best? It's where are the services that I'm already using? Where do they live? Which cloud am I already kind of looking at?
Yep. Anything to add to that, Ivan?
No, they really covered it all. Obviously, there's a engineer perspective there as well. A company's going to lean more toward something that their engineers have a little bit of experience with, even if that's from outside or other pieces of their life. So often there's temptation to switch clouds, and there's a lot of value in something that our engineers significantly know. So that's going to sort of steer things as well.
Yeah. The last thing I'd add is, every cloud does have different incentives, and it's important to get in front of the clouds themselves as well as resellers. Also, if you use a service partner like Fairwinds or someone similar, we have relationships with the clouds. Often a cloud will pay us to help with the migration, which is a significant incentive depending on your cloud spend. So there is reason to shop those things around. You can go sign up for an AWS account and pay the rate that AWS gives you when you just put in your credit card. But if you have any kind of significant speed or any kind of significant spend, every single cloud will negotiate with you. And the joke I read recently said there's something like 2,400,000 different rates on AWS because they literally negotiate with everyone. As the next thing, how do we consider what a company is going to move first?
I think you've got to.
Go ahead, Ivan.
I think you've got to balance the learning versus risk. Find something that's going to be an appreciable benefit for the business, a good test migration, a good experience for the engineers doing the work. If internal buy-in is a bit of a challenge, perhaps getting everybody exactly on the same page with respect to moving from Heroku to Kubernetes, maybe move something smaller. Well, because you're going to be spending cycles also building comfort while you're building skills and while you're doing the work.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's
go ahead, Nate.
That's a great point. I was going to say it really depends on how big the service is you're running. If you're running a bunch of microservices already, it may be easy to pick that apart and move it one by one over into Kubernetes. If your application's already built out kind of as a monolith, you may have to do it all in one chunk. So it kind of depends on the situation.
Yeah, I would also say you're hearing Nate and Ivan say it depends, and this is a significant part of everything in the cloud. Everything in operations is a series of trade-offs, and this is a little bit today of just how our engineers think about these trade-offs. If you have a monolithic application that you need moved over, it's not the kind of thing you can break up into a million pieces and move some business uncritical piece into Kubernetes and kick the tires. So in that situation, I highly suggest having help. And that's either hiring very experienced Kubernetes engineers or that's going with a company like Fairwinds that can make sure you're going to be successful. It is a different paradigm. It is a whole new world. You can succeed with it, but if you don't know what you're doing, you're going to learn a lot of things the hard way, and it's always good to leverage other people's scars. Finally, on this one, how are you going to migrate your data?
Yeah, I touched on this a little bit, depending on where your data already lives. It's if it's already in AWS or somewhere like that, you may not want to move your data. That's probably my biggest advice. If it makes sense, if you're working with a small data set, it may be really easy, like a MySQL database that's only a couple gigs. You could port that over to any cloud provider pretty easily. It really depends. I hate to say that, but it depends on how much data we're talking here. Ivan has a good insight into running persistence inside of Kubernetes.
Yeah.
You want to talk about that briefly?
No. So a couple things I'll say about data though, and I will talk about persistence and Kube a little bit. I think that's one of the variables I alluded to a bit ago, describing a bit of cultural shift, the work of actually migrating an application, and then are you changing where your data lives? There's also elements of how does your data get populated. So Heroku gives you a degree of, some of this relates a bit to the review apps, but Heroku gives you a degree of, I can kind of connect the database layer with the application layer and how things are spun up and populated. That can still happen in a Kubernetes world, but it's a consideration that you need to decide a few things about how am I going to initialize a potential new database with seed data for a staging environment, or what Heroku calls review apps and so on. As far as running state in Kubernetes, what these guys are alluding to is that it can be done, absolutely. It's something that is possible. There are what Kubernetes calls primitives, object types that allow you to have persistent storage, auto provisioning, all these cool things. We highly recommend not making that be something that's part of this journey, especially to start. And farther than that, we recommend using managed cloud services, object store like S3 or GCS, that kind of thing, to house your data instead of having it live in Kubernetes alongside your app. Ideally, your apps are as ephemeral as they can be in Kube.
Yeah.
So we need to keep moving along, so I'm going to dive in. We did have a question come in that says, with Kubernetes being the same or virtually the same on all the clouds, does the focus now shift to security? So I think it's important that we clarify, running Kubernetes itself is going to be, it used to be standing up Kubernetes was really difficult, and that was a significant percentage of what people were paying us to help them do. Now you can stand up Kubernetes on just about any cloud relatively easily. But Kubernetes itself is not a platform as a service. Kubernetes itself is the framework for that. So all the configuration pieces, you still have to get into the nitty-gritty of, and it is different on every cloud. And yes, the security ramifications are different on every cloud. Clicking a button, getting a cluster is not the same as getting a secure cluster. It's not the same as making sure everything's locked down the way that you need it to be locked down. So be aware of that. But we need to move on just to make sure we get through everything. So I think we have one more poll here as we get to the dive into process.
So the polling question should be on your screen now. What scares you most about adopting Kubernetes? You can select from, it's a new paradigm that I'm unfamiliar with. It has a lot of hype and I'm not sure it's worth it. Fear, I will do it insecurely, unreliably, or inefficiently. Or comfort with my current system and nervousness about change. Sounds like real life these days. Go ahead and make your solution. Yeah, exactly. Go ahead and make your selection. And just a final reminder, guys, before we get into the question and answer period, if you have a question, you don't have to wait until then. Just go ahead and use that GoToWebinar control panel and submit your question. And hopefully we'll have, I would hope, about 10 minutes or so near the end of the webinar to go through the questions. All right, with that, we will go ahead and close out the poll, and here are the results.
Yeah, so it looks like it's a new paradigm I'm unfamiliar with. That's definitely a thing we see a lot. Has a lot of hype. I'm not sure it's worth it. Interesting to me that that's the lowest one. I feel like that's often the loudest one we hear. Although I guess if you're here listening to a Kubernetes webinar, you may already be at a point where you've decided the hype is worth it. It is new, it is different, but it is worth it. Fear I'll do it insecurely, unreliably, or inefficiently. I do believe, as I said at the beginning of this, if that was not a fear for people, I think most everyone would already be on Kubernetes. And comfort with my current system and nervousness about change being at 23% makes sense as well. Change is always scary. Okay, well, let's dive into some of the process and get into some of the specifics. So we have an entire slide on security, reliability, and efficiency, so we'll get there. But as we think about the process for moving to Kubernetes, let's talk about, Heroku has basically everything built in. And when you move away from that, we need to choose all kinds of other tooling. Nate, can you talk a little bit about some of, what are the other pieces of tooling people need, and what are some of the defaults that we suggest?
Sure, yeah. So yeah, with Heroku, you get a lot of these things out of the box. For Kubernetes, it's just a framework, it's like getting a frame of a car, and then you kind of have to put the pieces together inside, I think for CI/CD, you could pick really anything. We recommend, or we use in most cases, Circle CI. For our monitoring, we use Datadog. Logging, we typically also use Datadog as well. But there's a whole suite of CNCF tools out there that you can leverage, like Prometheus and the Elk stack for all your logging. It really depends on what makes sense for your company. Yeah,
there's also options that are all inclusive. So if you need something like the experience you had on Heroku, there's tools like GitLab that have basically everything, for the whole stack up until you've delivered your workload. And yeah, my internet just froze out. Okay, go ahead, Nate.
You're good.
I was just saying, GitLab has a really nice integration with Kubernetes. It has even like Helm integration, which is pretty cool. GitLab's kind of a one-stop shop, which is pretty neat.
Yeah.
Yeah, we do tend to recommend Helm, and if you have another thing, you're welcome to, of course, use whatever fits best for your processes. But we also have something called Rocket Scripts, which is ROK8S scripts, so kind of the Kate's moniker thing, and that's an open source offering of scripts that helps to wrap some of the deployment and CI process and make some of that a little bit easier in terms of configuring things to talk to cloud and to talk to a Kubernetes cluster as part of your deployment. For real quick, for the Heroku review apps, I know that's something that comes up a lot, understandably, during these kind of migrations. We have something called RBAC Manager that can help assign RBAC permissions in Kubernetes to these new namespaces that can get deployed as part of your Kubernetes version of review apps. RBAC Manager is another open source tool that you can check out today. I'm talking fast because I want to try to hammer all through this as well, because the more questions we see, the faster we'll go with slides. We'd like to get to questions for you all.
Yeah, so there's a whole bunch of tools. Actually, it's one of the harder problems is what are all the add-ons you need to go from a Kubernetes cluster to a production-ready Kubernetes cluster. And if you want advice on that, Fairwinds has a whole bunch of open source. We're happy to talk with you about the specific pieces that you need to get moved over. But once you've chosen all of those additional pieces, be it Jenkins or Circle, be it Datadog or Elk stack, how do you then move into testing and scaling and load testing and those pieces? What else is needed to be done before a company switches over to Kubernetes? Can you talk a little bit about how you go about those pieces?
Sure. So Kubernetes supports scaling on compute and also other metrics. We recommend picking a metric that's meaningful to your application and the performance of your application. So CPU is an easy one that is a common go-to, and it works, but it's a bit separated from what does your application actually care about. You can use metrics from Datadog, which, as Kendall mentioned, we use for monitoring as our standard, or you can also use Stackdriver from Google. You can have Datadog scrape other metrics from Prometheus-like endpoints that are made available from all kinds of other tooling in the cluster, including things that can help you measure latency, connecting to your service, so on and so forth. So these are all examples of things you have access to, and you want to plug into the appropriate combination of those for your app so that you can scale it in Kubernetes.
Yeah, I would say if your application's already exposing a metric, it would be pretty simple to get Kubernetes to scale on that metric.
Yeah. And finally, a lot of folks ask us, what does the actual switchover look like? And I do just want to say that once you have all of your application deploying into Kubernetes, it can be as easy as a DNS switchover. That's hand wavy. There's lots of pieces before you get there, but the actual physical production change can be that easy if you have everything else sorted first. So let's move on. Optimize for security, reliability, and efficiency. So, you move out of a PaaS and now you own the entire infrastructure, and there are a lot more places to make mistakes. Nate, can you talk about all the different levels that companies need to think about security in Kubernetes?
Sure, yeah. So I'll take that first bullet point or that sub bullet point and kind of walk backwards through it. Say you move on to AWS. That's one security level that you're going to have to think about. You're going to have to think about who's accessing your AWS account, who's getting into your AWS resources, and then below that, you're going to create a VPC, and that VPC is where your cluster is going to go. You'll have to think about your networking at that point and how your machines are communicating. Are they exposed to the internet? What do your security groups look like? And then further down inside of the cluster, there's another access level there to say who can call your Kubernetes API to do things inside of that cluster, like create new deployments, delete deployments, read secrets, things like that. And then there's the pod level, which you can basically have a service account inside of Kubernetes, and that pod can do things inside the cluster based on the access of that service account. So there's a couple levels of security that you have to think about.
Yep. And let's talk about efficiency a little bit. So, when people think about efficiency, there's all kinds of pieces within Kubernetes. Ivan, talk about the kinds of things we're trying to optimize for on the efficiency side.
Sure. Efficiency is a little bit of a catch-all thing too. It's a real thing, but it's also where all the other stuff gets thrown. So there's going to be a little bit of repeat here too, but Kubernetes bin packs containers on your Kubernetes nodes pretty nicely. You want to right size your instances in cloud so that you've got a little bit of headroom, but you can also avoid too much thrashing, scaling your cluster as your applications scale up and down. You want to set your resource requirements and resource limits in your Kubernetes pods. The requirements part helps the pods get bin packed on your nodes, and it helps them not impact other workloads or other key functions of your cluster. Limits are important for scaling your applications and avoiding runaway processes, also impacting things without wasting resources. So there's a little bit of a balance there. We've got a nice open source tool called Goldilocks that's also integrated into some of our other tooling as well. Goldilocks is really cool. It uses something called vertical pod autoscaler to help give you recommendations on where you should set these sometimes elusive resource requests and limits. You can also use things, I'm going to just rattle some stuff off here so we can get to Q&A. Use node selection to help certain applications target certain nodes that have maybe special resources. You can also use spot or preemptible instances to help save you some money. So all of this pile of things that we could dig into, certainly with you all, are going to tie into helping your things be way more efficient.
Yeah, and I'll say this may sound overwhelming. There is a lot to consider here. Kubernetes is endlessly configurable. It can be done well, it can be run smoothly, and you can succeed with this. We have open source tools that make that easier. Like Ivan mentioned, Goldilocks. On the role-based access control side, we have RBAC Manager, a couple other tools there, and there's lots of open source. Dig through our GitHub. It's going to help you succeed with Kubernetes. We also have SaaS products and services as well. But on the reliability side, even, you know, staying up to date with the latest versions is complicated. We also have open source that digs through everything that you have running in your Kubernetes cluster and tells you what's outdated, what needs to be upgraded, etc. Keeping on top of known vulnerabilities is important. You're going to have a lot of different pieces running. It's not Heroku version 1, Heroku version 2. I don't know if Heroku even does it that simply. You have Kubernetes, you have Helm, you have, you know, all the other pieces that are running inside of your cluster, from, you know, the things we were just talking about, what you're using to deploy into it. If you're running Jenkins, you got to keep that up to date. You know, if you're running Prometheus yourself, you need to keep that up to date. All those different pieces, patching and upgrades is something that you need to stay on top of. And Nate, give a plug for our software there, and then we'll move on.
Sure, yeah. So for the keeping up to date with latest versions, we have a tool called not Goldilocks. We have a tool called Pluto, Pluto and Nova, and those we have too many. Yeah, Pluto and Nova will look for those deprecated versions in your cluster and kind of call out what you need to upgrade.
Yep. Okay, and finally, revisit and reevaluate your goals. When you're done with this migration, what kinds of things are people going to be able to report to the executive team about what has been accomplished? You've migrated over to Kubernetes. What are some of the big wins? Ivan?
This kind of ties into what we, the other bookend that we started with as well, right?
Sure.
The motivations in the company. Ideally, you can show some savings because of how you're scaling and some of those efficiency points that were talked about a bit ago. You probably will have increased agility, faster deploys, abilities to react to common vulnerabilities that come out, or fixing bugs in your application, more flexibility, more things that you have control over, no more quote unquote, we can't do X because we don't have control over it because it lives in the magic garden of the platform as a service, and freeing up cycles for engineers to work on the next set of problems is a huge one, I think.
Yeah, and I know that, you know, questions that we typically get are, is Kubernetes going to make us a DevOps culture? And, you know, there's no tool that solves getting to a DevOps culture at your company. However, good tooling does enable it. And if Kubernetes is used right, a developer has the ability to write code, package it up into a container, ship it to an environment, and have visibility into how well that's running in that environment. And even then, maintain pager for their specific services. So service ownership is really a way that I see a lot of companies going. And when the developer has the ability to ship everything through, see how it's running in production, and actually own that, service ownership becomes a real possibility. So Kubernetes itself does not enable that. You're going to need good culture around that, but it is a helpful thing to have tools that get you there. Finally, you know, Ivan touched on cost savings. We also had a question come in: what is the typical cost to migrate Heroku to Kubernetes? Kubernetes requires more tools to manage and maintain. And I'll touch on this at a high level, and then Ivan, Nate, if you have anything to add. We try to be careful not to say, hey, you're going to save this much when you move from Heroku to Kubernetes. It really depends on how much you're spending. Heroku gets a lot more expensive at larger tiers. When your data gets really, really big, Heroku becomes shockingly expensive, and throwing that in RDS will sometimes save you tremendous amounts of money. It is very common for us to see people's cloud spend drop 50%. In a migration from Heroku to Kubernetes. They have a lot more control over the tweaks and dials, and if done right, your cloud bill can go down significantly. You're paying for that PaaS, and there's a lot of nice things about it, but at some scale, it becomes overwhelming. Now, what's interesting about this question is you're touching on the other costs of maintaining everything related to Kubernetes. It is bigger, it is more complicated. You know, one of the reasons companies hire us is we have a managed service that's, you know, about the cost of a single person, that makes this migration smooth and helps maintain it for the long term. Often companies, when they're migrating to Kubernetes, are going to go out and hire 3 to 5 engineers to make sure everything is up and running correctly and to handle that pager overhead now. So there is hidden costs based on that, and those are all things that you need to consider. If you have good tooling that helps you efficiently run all these things, it's going to save you time and money. If you have good insight into what you're doing right, so that you're not making all the mistakes the hard way, it's going to save you time and money. And I think I probably relatively exhaustively covered that. But Nate, Ivan, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I would just say Kubernetes is only as good as you make it. You can do it. You can definitely do it wrong. It's easy to do it wrong, and you can definitely do it right. It's also easy to do it right. There's just a lot of moving pieces. So Kubernetes, like to address one of the bullet points earlier or from the polls, how there's a lot of hype around it. I think, yeah, there is a lot of hype, but I think there's also a lot of misunderstanding. It's a framework and a set of tools that you can use to run your applications in a reliable and scalable way, and it's easily done wrong. So just want to throw that out there.
Really well said, and I've got nothing. Awesome.
Yeah, well, I mean, that just reminds me that, so we have been using Kubernetes for 4 years. 4 years ago, Kubernetes was much less mature. And running Kubernetes at scale for some companies, we've run into very different problems as running Kubernetes at scale for other companies. It's one thing to have relatively calm workloads. It's another thing to need to spin up and kill off a pod every quarter second. There's all kinds of issues that happen depending on what your internal networking looks like, the way that you scale, how your workloads, when high traffic happens. The beauty of Kubernetes is that if run right, your usage will very closely match your spend. This has been the promise of the cloud for a long, long time. But if you took your instances from the data center and you dumped them on an instance in the cloud, you did not see those cost savings. You just ran long-running instances. Kubernetes can scale up and scale down all day long, all month long, all year long, and your spend will very, very closely match your actual usage, which is a big deal.
I would say,
that's why part of the paradigm. So part of the paradigm shift is potentially re-architecting some infrastructure and re-architecting application into the quote-unquote cloud-native paradigm. There's a bunch of factors you can go read about that help you move into an architecture that's going to make better use of things like cloud, things like Kubernetes. Sorry, go ahead, Nate. What were you going to say?
I was just going to say one thing about scaling. Typically in Heroku, you're picking a dyno size and you're scaling that dyno up based on some metric. Kubernetes gives you 2 levels of scaling that you can achieve. You can scale your pod, which is almost comparable to a dyno, and then the pod runs on an underlying node, and that node is what is going to increase and decrease your costs. So scaling up your pods, that's where you can kind of achieve that efficient resource usage, where if you have enough space on your nodes to run more pods, you're not going to incur more costs by spinning up and scaling your pods, unless they won't fit on the amount of nodes you have. So that's kind of where you can achieve that nice balance of resource scaling. Where with the dyno,
really tight
up and only use 30% of it, but you're getting charged for 100% of it.
Ivan, what were you going to say?
I was going to transition, sorry. So I was just saying, I know we're really kind of tight on time here, and I was looking at some of the questions. Somebody asked for a clarification. What was the scripts that I mentioned before that was part of the discussion around CI? It's called Rocket Scripts. So if you look at the Fairwinds Ops GitHub organization, there's a repo there called ROK8S-script.
Yep. Yeah, and we're already touching on a few of these questions, but let's dive into some more of them. So this question says, if I'm not on cloud already, would you advise me to use Kubernetes on premise? And Ivan, Nate, do one of you want to start with that? And then I have things to say about it. But
you can definitely use Kubernetes on-prem. You may not have the nice auto scaling of nodes, and you may have to build your access into your cluster by yourself. Kubernetes is nice because it integrates with the cloud provider, and then when you're interacting with Kubernetes, you just say, hey, I want the service to be exposed to the internet, and Kubernetes will call your cloud provider and generate a load balancer and do all of the routing for you and connect everything. If If you're running on-prem, you're going to have to think about all that yourself. You're going to have to think about load balancing. You're going to have to think about how you're going to get traffic into your cluster. And then you're going to have to think about scaling too. So if you're running on VMware, I know there's a nice integration there, but if you're not, you're going to have to think about it.
And there are options for that egress stuff, but it's things that kind of come out of the box, and it's especially nice to get started having that stuff in cloud. If you're looking at what load balancer do I run in my data center, what kind of integration is available for that with Kubernetes, how well does that integration run, what are the gotchas there, do I need to do BGP routing to expose my ingress IP addresses in my data center? That's not stuff you have to care about at all in cloud.
Yeah. I mean, I think you're both saying what I would simplify down to. The beauty of Kubernetes is you have an API and you interact with the API, and your developers interact with the API. And if configured correctly, that's the whole thing. Now, there's some level of configuring on every cloud that's complex, but if you're running it on-prem, it's extremely complex, and you have to have a team just to manage all of the other pieces, and so that your engineers just have to interact with the API. In the cloud, it can be simplified down to everyone's interacting with that, and with the right engineers, they can help maintain all those pieces. So there's reasons to run things on-prem. There are always going to be workloads that need to be run in your own data center. That's not going to go away probably ever. But for the vast majority of companies, running things in the cloud is going to save you just a lot of pain and heartache. Okay, let's get into some specifics here. Egress from Calico. We'll do that aspect from getting traffic into the cluster. Any comments on that? I guess that's more a comment, not a question.
Sounds like not a question, and I'm not egress from Calico. Yeah, I'm not sure. It says egress, and it also talks about getting things into cluster. So I'm not sure whether that was really meant from an egress or ingress perspective. If that is a question though, and it's something you'd like us to talk about more, and you're still on the webinar, please feel free to repost something, because we don't want to ignore you. We just don't want to talk about the wrong direction. So
sure. This is kind of an interesting question. It says, a bit of an offbeat question, since Kubernetes came from a flavor of Borg from Google some 6 years back. Has Borg evolved to a whole new level by now that we don't yet have in Kubernetes? So I have a number of friends that work at Google, and I'll just speak a little bit to this at a high level. Unless you're at Google, you don't interact with Borg. Borg was written very specifically to solve Google's problem. And Google has a unique problem that they run at the world's largest scale, period, right? Maybe Netflix challenges them in some scale aspects. For everyone else, there's Kubernetes. And I think that's part of the beauty of what folks did in packaging Kubernetes up is, Google has solved problems that only Google has with Borg. And there needs to be some changes and simplifications. What's interesting to me is that it's my understanding that Google does still heavily internally operate on top of Borg. They have not decided to dog food Kubernetes for their majority of their infrastructure. So they do continue to run as two sort of separate things that I'm sure are evolving in different ways. But the community backing behind Kubernetes and the speed with which it has matured as a project is pretty astounding one way or another. So
yeah, absolutely.
Let's see. For me, what scares me is the frequency of release, and maybe that's the frequency of release around Kubernetes. Maybe that's the frequency of release around all the add-ons. What would y'all say about that? I mean, there is a lot of different pieces. There is a lot of different releases.
Yeah, I guess it depends on which release we're talking about. Kubernetes, you have to keep up to date with it. You can't just build a cluster and then let it sit, because the rapid evolution that Kendall was talking about, it's if you set up a Kubernetes cluster last year, it's getting to that latest version of Kubernetes is going to take a lot of steps. So yeah, I can kind of relate to the being scared about the frequency of release, but one of the cool things about Kubernetes is it's built as a distributed system, and you can take down pieces of it and bring up new pieces of it without incurring any downtime on your services, as long as your services are built to handle disruptions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
there is some talk of a long-term support release that's still in process. There's a KEP, which is what Kubernetes calls their enhancement proposals. You can search for, I think, starting with version 119, and they're exploring previous versions. They're looking at the merits of having a version that continues to get security fixes and so on for a longer cadence than the quarterly release cycle. So that's I would still highly recommend becoming comfortable and familiar with regular patching of Kubernetes and also your add-ons and all your tooling in your cluster, just like Nate described about Kubernetes. All those things are true for your add-ons as well, things like your ingress controller, et cetera. But there is that LTS release if you're a business that is really constrained by when certain things can happen. The LTS might help you there.
Yeah.
But also, that's something that we're really good at.
Yeah, well, this is we need to wrap up here and hand back to Charlene for the end, but I want to give a brief pitch. So again, Fairwinds, this is all we do at Fairwinds. We help companies make these kinds of migrations. We can help you navigate everything from which cloud are you going to move to hands-on, best practices, getting it set up right. We offer 24/7 pager as a service for those that want that. We can give you a Heroku-like experience on Kubernetes, customized to meet your business's needs. We have 2 white papers highlighted here, migrating from Heroku to Kubernetes, that you can dig into. We have a best practices on Kubernetes that will dig into security, reliability, efficiency, all of these different pieces. We have a tremendous amount of open source that's linked to right here. You can also dig through our GitHub, and feel free to contact us directly. Yeah, we're really good at this. If you want help with Kubernetes, learn from our scars. We have an offering, be it software, be it open source, or be it a service that's going to save you time and money. Thank you, everyone. This was the journey from Heroku to Kubernetes in 5 steps. And Charlene, I'll hand it back to you to wrap things up.
All right, great. Well, thanks so much. You guys, what a great conversation. I really, really enjoyed watching the whole thing. So, and judging from the questions that we got from the audience, good stuff, good stuff. I know they got a lot out of it too. So do want to thank everybody who did submit questions. There were some really great ones there. If we didn't get to all of your questions during the webinar, please know that the folks are going to get a copy of all of the questions that came through. So I'm sure somebody from the organization will be happy to follow up with you offline and get your question answered. Okay, also want to remind the audience that today's event has been recorded. So if you missed any or all of the event, or if you just want to watch it again, you'll have the opportunity to do so. Following today's webinar, we will be sending out an email that contains a link to access the webinar on demand. And the webinar is also going to be living on the devops.com website, so you can always go look for it there. Just go to devops.com/webinars, look in the on demand section, and it should be right there waiting for you. All right, I did mention at the top of the hour that we would be doing a drawing for 4 $25 Amazon gift cards. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get to that now. Let's see, our first winner today is Ranga S. Congratulations, Ranga. Our second winner today is Gary H. Congratulations, Gary. Third winner today, Jason L. Congratulations, Jason. And our fourth and final winner today is Chandra T. Congratulations, Chandra. We'll be following up with all 4 of you offline via email to get your gift card over to you. Check your inbox. If you don't see it in your inbox, please check your spam folder. Let's see, Nate, Ivan, Kendall, thank you all for such a great presentation. As I said, such great information, so interesting, and love the conversation. And so I appreciate your time, appreciate your expertise, and thanks so much for joining me today.
Awesome. Thank you.
Great, great, great. Also want to thank the audience for joining me today. This is Charlene O'Hanlon, and I am signing off. Have a great day, everybody. Please stay safe.
Thanks.